She told the billionaire she was pregnant. He laughed in her face. 5 years later, she returned, with his 3 identical sons. Claire Harper had never thought of herself as special. She was one of those people who faded into the background, quiet, polite, and invisible in a city that thrived on noise and confidence. Fresh out of college, with a degree that hadn't opened any real doors, she was lucky to land a job as an assistant in one of New York's biggest investment companies. The pay barely covered her rent, but at least she was there, in the world she had once dreamed of: marble floors, glass walls, and men in sharp suits moving like they owned time itself. That was where she met Henry Black. Everyone in the company knew his name long before they saw him in person. He was the kind of man people whispered about when he passed through the hallway. The youngest CEO the firm had ever had, a self-made billionaire, brilliant and terrifying. He had the kind of presence that made rooms go silent, and when he looked at you, it felt as if he saw right through you, and maybe he did. His eyes were pale, almost icy, his voice calm, his words measured. He didn't smile often, but when he did, people worked twice as hard the next day just to see it again. Claire met him by accident. Literally. She was carrying a stack of reports to the conference room when she turned the corner too fast and collided with him. The papers scattered, her cheeks burned, and she muttered a dozen apologies. Henry didn't shout. He didn't even frown. He bent down, helped her gather the documents, and said, almost absently, "Careful. The market's not the only thing that crashes around here." It was a small, dry joke, but it stayed with her all day. After that, he noticed her. Not in a fairy tale way, more like he started remembering her name when others didn't. He asked her to assist on small projects, trusted her to organize his schedule. Claire couldn't understand why. She wasn't glamorous or witty or powerful like the women who hovered around him at company parties. But he seemed to enjoy her calmness, the way she didn't try too hard to impress him. One late evening, when the office was nearly empty, they shared a conversation over coffee that somehow turned into dinner, then laughter, then something deeper. The romance that followed wasn't grand or loud. It was quiet, private, and fragile, built on stolen moments and long nights where he dropped the armor he wore in front of the world. He told her about the pressure, the sleeplessness, the constant hunger to stay at the top. She listened. She made him feel human again, he said once, half asleep, his head resting on her lap. And she believed him. She believed that beneath his cold exterior there was warmth meant only for her. Weeks turned into months. Claire tried not to dream too far ahead, but it was impossible not to. She imagined waking up beside him without fear, being part of his world, maybe even building a family someday. So when the pregnancy test turned positive, her heart trembled, not with fear, but with a shy kind of joy. It felt like proof that their love was real, that something good had come out of all the uncertainty. She went to his office one evening after work, heart pounding, her hands shaking slightly. He was sitting behind his desk, reading something on his tablet, his sleeves rolled up, the city lights pouring through the glass behind him. She smiled nervously, told him she needed to talk. When she finally said the words, "I'm pregnant," the world seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, Henry said nothing. Then he leaned back, a slow, almost amused smile curling on his lips. "You're serious?" he asked. She nodded. His laugh was quiet at first, then sharper, colder. "Claire, you're a sweet girl," he said, standing up, walking around the desk as if inspecting her from a distance. "But let's be realistic. I'm a millionaire CEO, and you're, what? An assistant. You think this is how things work?" The words hit harder than a slap. She felt her throat close. He wasn't angry, that would have been easier to bear. He was indifferent. Detached. As if she had told him something trivial, something unworthy of concern. She tried to speak, to explain that she hadn't planned it, that she wasn't asking for anything. But he cut her off with a gesture of his hand. "Handle it," he said simply. "And don't make this into a drama. You knew what this was." That night, she left the building in the pouring rain, her vision blurred not just by tears but by disbelief. The city lights around her seemed cruelly bright. Her phone rang once, his number, but she couldn't answer. By morning, her access card didn't work. The company had restructured her position. She didn't even get a chance to clear her desk. Henry Black went on with his life, and Claire Harper disappeared from it. What he didn't know, what he never cared to ask, was that the thing he had dismissed so easily would become the very heart of hers. Claire didn't remember the exact moment she decided to leave New York. It wasn't dramatic. There was no packed suitcase in the rain, no last look at the skyline. It was quieter than that, a slow unraveling of hope, until staying felt heavier than leaving. She found a map, closed her eyes, and pointed. The finger landed on a small town in New Jersey she had never heard of before. That was enough. She sold what little she owned, terminated her lease, and vanished from the city where her heart had broken and her life had ended, or so it had felt. The town was nothing like Manhattan. The buildings were shorter, the streets quieter, the people slower to speak but quicker to nod hello. There were no honking taxis, no coffee carts on every corner, no midnight rush of people chasing something urgent. Here, time moved differently. At first, Claire hated it. The silence was deafening. She missed the chaos, even the pain of it. But as her belly grew, so did her awareness that this was exactly where she needed to be. The noise of the city wouldn't have let her hear what mattered, the sound of tiny heartbeats that pulsed 3 times over during every doctor's appointment. Triplets. The word had stunned her when the doctor first said it. She had stared at the screen, at the 3 little flickering lights that proved there were 3 lives inside her, not just one. She laughed and cried at the same time, her hands shaking on the examination table. It wasn't joy or fear, it was both, tangled into something she didn't yet have words for. It felt too big for one body to carry, emotionally, physically, financially. But she had no choice. And strangely, even in her darkest hours, she never considered giving up on them. Pregnancy was hard. With no family support, her parents had dismissed her situation as shameful and refused to speak to her. Claire was alone from the very beginning. Her body changed faster than she could keep up. The hospital bills started stacking before she had even finished her 2nd trimester. Food cravings mixed with nausea. Sleep became a stranger. She could feel each of her babies moving at different times, sometimes all at once, stretching her from the inside. Every kick reminded her of what was coming, not just babies, but a life rebuilt from scratch. She worked when she could, took freelance editing jobs online, and when those dried up, she started baking in her tiny kitchen and selling desserts to the local cafe. It wasn't much, but it kept her afloat. When the boys arrived early, 6 weeks before her due date, it was during a snowstorm. The pain came suddenly, sharp and fast, and the panic that followed nearly swallowed her. She was rushed to the nearest hospital, a place with flickering lights and tired nurses, and gave birth to 3 premature but breathing baby boys. Jake, Josh, and Jaden. Their names came to her like echoes, like they'd always been waiting. They were small, too small, and they had to stay in incubators for weeks. Claire visited them every day, pressing her palm against the glass, whispering to them through tears, singing lullabies off-key but full of love. The debt grew larger. Medical bills arrived like threats in the mail. Claire rationed food, sold her laptop, and walked everywhere to avoid bus fares. Winter bit at her skin, but she bundled her sons in hand-me-down clothes and knitted blankets donated by kind neighbors. The town didn't ask questions. It offered help in small ways: a free pie left on her porch, a coat hung on her door, a note from a stranger saying she was seen, she was strong. Still, the loneliness was a creature with claws. There were nights when she sat on the bathroom floor and sobbed, biting her fist to keep quiet so the babies wouldn't wake. She missed being touched, asked about, remembered. Sometimes she stared at her reflection and saw no one familiar. But each morning she woke up to 3 new reasons to keep going. Jake was the first to smile, wide and sudden. Josh clung to her finger like he never wanted to let go. Jaden made tiny, thoughtful noises like he was already curious about the world. As they grew, so did her strength. She learned how to feed 3 babies with 2 hands, how to sleep in 15-minute intervals, how to rock one while changing another. The local library offered her a part-time job, shelving books and running children's story hour. She took it gladly. The smell of old paper and quiet corners became her peace. After work, she baked late into the night, cookies, muffins, anything she could sell. Her kitchen became her sanctuary. The boys learned the rhythm of her footsteps, the softness of her voice, the safe cadence of her lullabies. Life was not easy. It was never easy. But it became bearable, then manageable, and eventually meaningful. The pain of her past still lingered, but it no longer defined her. Claire had found a strange, tender kind of joy, not in the life she had once imagined, but in the one she was building with her own 2 hands. Every scraped knee she kissed, every fever she soothed, every silly drawing pinned to the fridge became proof that love didn't need to come from grand gestures or perfect beginnings. Sometimes it came in survival. Sometimes it came in the quiet miracle of waking up, holding your children close, and knowing you made it one more day. Henry Black had everything. That's what the world said, anyway. His name appeared in financial magazines, Forbes lists, and on glowing screens behind television anchors who spoke about his rise with a mix of awe and envy. He was the man who turned dying companies into billion-dollar machines. Real estate, tech, pharmaceuticals, his fingers were in every profitable pie, and whatever he touched seemed to multiply in value. He owned a penthouse overlooking Central Park, several vacation homes across Europe, and a private jet that bore no logo, just sleek anonymity. But no matter how much he acquired, it never felt like enough. He lived on fast decisions and faster consequences. Every morning began with a flood of emails and ended with a glass of something aged and expensive that he barely tasted. Women came and went, beautiful, poised, always dressed for photographs. They laughed at his jokes, touched his arm during charity galas, and disappeared without resistance when he stopped returning calls. He couldn't remember most of their names. His assistant kept a list, just in case he needed to send a birthday gift or flowers. He rarely did. What no one saw, what no one knew, was that despite the endless stream of luxury and attention, Henry had grown tired. Tired of the games, the noise, the pretending. Every time he opened his eyes to a new morning, it was harder to shake the feeling that something was missing, not something material, not something he could buy. It was deeper than that, almost like an ache in his chest that never quite went away. Sometimes, late at night, after the meetings were done and the world had quieted for a few precious hours, he would sit on the balcony of his penthouse and think about her. Claire. The name still brought something sharp and uncomfortable to the surface. He had almost forgotten her face, but then, not really. He could still picture the way her eyes looked when she was angry, the sound of her laughter when she didn't think anyone was listening, the softness of her skin beneath his fingers. She had been different from the others, quiet but not dull, kind without being naive. She hadn't wanted anything from him except his honesty, and when he failed to give her that, she had walked away. No, that wasn't the truth. She hadn't just walked away. He had pushed her. Hard. He remembered the conversation, even though he tried not to. The way she had stood there, trembling, her voice small but steady, telling him she was pregnant. And how he had laughed. God, he hated that memory. At the time, it had felt like the only thing he could do. Laugh. Dismiss it. Minimize the panic clawing up his throat. He hadn't known how to respond to something so real, so unexpected. So he had crushed it. Crushed her. Told himself it was necessary, that he was protecting his life from spiraling. But deep down, some part of him had known he was making a mistake, one he couldn't undo. He told himself she would call. That she would come back and ask for support. Women always did. They said they didn't want anything, but eventually, they came back with lawyers and court orders. But Claire never did. She vanished. No emails. No messages. No angry phone calls. Just silence, like she had erased herself from the planet. At first, he had been relieved. Then curious. Then confused. Now, years later, he was haunted by it. He never spoke about her. Not to his board, not to his friends, not that he had many of those. His life was built on transactions, not connections. But when he closed his eyes, her voice still echoed in places he thought had gone silent long ago. And the worst part was that he didn't know where she had gone or what had happened to her. He had looked once, quietly, hiring a private investigator for a month, but they found nothing useful. She had been meticulous. Changed addresses. Disconnected numbers. She had truly wanted to disappear. And she had succeeded. Henry tried to bury himself in work, again and again. Bigger deals. Riskier ventures. He attended every event he was invited to, threw money at charities, bought art he didn't even like. He filled his days with noise. But the silence always returned. And when he passed by playgrounds or heard the word "father" in conversation, something deep in his gut twisted. He didn't know why he kept thinking about the child. Maybe because there was a possibility, however small, that something of his had been left behind. He hadn't wanted a family then, but now, the thought that he might have one without even knowing it clawed at him. He didn't believe in fate. But he believed in consequences. And this one, he feared, was finally catching up to him. More and more often, he found himself distracted. During meetings, his mind drifted. In the middle of dates, he would suddenly remember the look on Claire's face that night in his office. Cold regret clung to him like a second skin. And when he looked in the mirror, he sometimes didn't recognize the man staring back. The suits were the same. The face hadn't aged much. But the emptiness had grown louder. There was nothing left to chase. He had everything. And yet, all he could think about was what he might have lost. 5 years had passed, but Claire still remembered how it felt to walk into a room and not be seen. Not because she was shy or forgettable, but because she'd learned to fold herself into the edges of the world, to avoid attention. But that evening was different. That evening, she wore a long blue dress she had borrowed from a friend, a soft, flowing thing that made her feel briefly like someone who belonged somewhere grand. Her hair was pinned loosely, her earrings were second-hand, and her heels were 2 years old, but none of that mattered. She was there for the boys. The charity gala had been organized by a foundation that provided medical assistance to children with rare conditions, the same foundation that had helped her when her sons had needed speech therapy and developmental screenings in their early years. They had invited her as a guest of honor, someone who could speak to the importance of their work, someone whose story reminded people what donations could accomplish. Claire had hesitated at first. She didn't like stages or microphones or eyes on her, but the foundation had done so much for them. She owed them her presence, if nothing else. The restaurant where the event was held was a high-end place she'd never even dreamed of visiting before, all chandeliers, glass walls, and polished floors that reflected the light like a ballroom in a movie. She held Jake's hand on one side and Jaden's on the other. Josh walked just ahead, more confident than the rest, his bow tie slightly crooked and his eyes scanning the tables like he was already memorizing the place. They were dressed alike, not because she intended it to be charming, but because hand-me-downs and thrift shops had made matching outfits practical. Black pants, white shirts, little vests she had spent the previous night ironing. People stared. At first, Claire thought it was because she didn't fit in. But then she realized, it was the boys. 3 nearly identical faces, all with that same unusual combination, dark golden hair and striking blue-gray eyes that didn't quite belong to her. They drew attention wherever they went, but in that room filled with wealthy donors and distant glances, they stood out even more. The boys didn't seem to mind. They tugged at her sleeves, whispered questions, asked about the desserts on the table near the stage. They were full of life, unaware of the storm brewing just across the room. Henry hadn't intended to attend the event in person. Usually, his name and a sizable donation were enough. But this time, one of the foundation board members had insisted. He was their largest donor, after all, and a personal appearance would mean better press and more money from others trying to follow his lead. So he showed up late, dressed in a dark suit and a practiced smile, ready to endure another night of polite conversations and forced small talk. He had already started planning his exit when something, or rather, someone, caught the corner of his eye. He turned. At first, he wasn't sure what he was seeing. The woman was laughing gently, kneeling beside a child, no, 3 children, adjusting one of their bow ties while the others tugged at her sleeves. She stood slowly, elegant in a way that had nothing to do with wealth. Her face turned toward the light, and for a moment, everything around him faded into nothing. It was her. Claire. His mind reeled. She looked different, more grown, maybe, not in age, but in depth. The weight of life had left a mark on her, but she glowed with something more powerful than makeup or styling. Confidence. Grace. She stood taller now, not afraid of the room. And the children, 3 of them, each a mirror of himself. His mouth went dry. His heart slammed against his ribs. It couldn't be. He took a step forward, then stopped. People were still talking around him, glasses clinking, music playing softly, but it all sounded like it came from behind a wall. Claire turned slightly, and their eyes met. For a second, just a second, her face registered nothing. Then, recognition hit her like lightning. Her smile froze. Her hand instinctively reached toward the boys, drawing them closer. One of them noticed and glanced toward Henry, curious, but Claire quickly distracted him with a question, pulling his attention away. Henry couldn't move. He just stared. There they were. Not one child, 3. 3 perfect reflections. His hair. His eyes. His jaw. He felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. He couldn't breathe properly, couldn't think. All the years he'd spent wondering if she had gone through with it, if there had ever been a baby, had just shattered under the weight of reality. She hadn't just had his child. She had raised 3 sons, alone. Without him. Without a word. Claire looked away. She didn't walk toward him. She didn't smile. She simply turned and led her children toward the seating area, calm and composed, as if he were nothing but a face in the crowd. That hurt more than any shouted accusation would have. She didn't need him. That much was clear. And somehow, that truth cut deeper than the moment she'd told him she was pregnant. Henry sat down eventually, but he didn't hear a word of the speeches. The food in front of him went untouched. His eyes remained fixed on Claire, on the boys, trying to piece together the story of the years he had missed. He thought of all the boardrooms he'd sat in, all the late nights he had filled with hollow victories. While he was chasing more, she had been building something real. He didn't know how to process it. He only knew one thing for certain: he would never be the same again. Henry didn't sleep that night. After the charity gala, he returned to his penthouse, but the silence of the space felt different now, not peaceful, not spacious, just hollow. He stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker, the skyline stretching in the distance, and all he could think about was what he had seen. 3 boys. His sons. Claire. The past 5 years had unfolded without him, and yet the proof of those lost years had stood only feet away, dressed in vests and wide-eyed curiosity, carrying his face as if nature had taken a blueprint and copied it 3 times over. The boys had his eyes, no question, and that was what haunted him most. They didn't just look like him. They carried his blood, his name, even if they didn't know it yet. For days, Henry couldn't focus. Meetings blurred. Words turned to static. His mind refused to obey his commands. It was like a dam had cracked open somewhere inside, and everything he'd pushed down for years was rushing back with merciless force. He'd always prided himself on control. He controlled markets, people, boardrooms, outcomes. But this? This was something he had no power over. Claire had lived an entire life without him. She hadn't just survived, she had raised 3 boys into bright, joyful, beautiful little humans, and he hadn't even known their names. He knew he couldn't approach her that night. Not with donors around. Not with cameras and curious eyes. She hadn't looked at him like a man she used to love or hate, she'd looked at him like a stranger. And worse, like a threat. That burned in ways he hadn't expected. He had once made her laugh in elevators, made her sigh into his chest. Now she wouldn't even let him near her children. His children. The next week, he found her address. It wasn't hard. He had resources most people didn't. But he didn't knock on her door. Not yet. Instead, he drove to the small town on the edge of New Jersey where she now lived. It was nothing like the city. No high-rises, no black cars, no espresso bars with leather menus. The streets were lined with faded trees, kids on bicycles, dogs chasing leaves. It looked like the kind of place people went to disappear, or maybe to heal. And in the middle of it was Claire, walking down the sidewalk with a paper grocery bag, her boys skipping ahead, their laughter ringing like music he hadn't known he missed. He watched from a distance at first. He hated himself for it, but he couldn't help it. He parked a few blocks away from their house and sat in the car for hours, sometimes just to see them walk to school or return from the park. They were full of energy, constantly moving, constantly talking. Jake liked to jump over sidewalk cracks. Josh carried a notebook, scribbling things like a miniature detective. Jaden asked questions no one could answer, the kind of wild, curious questions that made Claire laugh and ruffle his hair. Henry was an outsider to all of it. Watching them like a man looking through a glass window into a world he didn't deserve to enter. But it didn't stop him from coming back. He started learning their routines. School at 8. Claire's library shifts during the day. Evening walks. Ice cream on Fridays. He watched her talk to neighbors, fix one boy's jacket, carry another when he fell asleep on her shoulder. She was still the same Claire, practical, warm, patient, but there was something stronger in her now. A kind of steel he hadn't noticed when she was younger. She had faced the world alone and come out not broken, but forged. Eventually, he couldn't stay away. The first time he spoke to her again, it was at the school parking lot. She was loading backpacks into the car when he stepped forward. Her body stiffened instantly, like she sensed him before she even saw him. Her eyes narrowed, guarded, calculating. She told the boys to wait in the car. Then she turned to him. "What are you doing here?" Her voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't kind either. He wanted to say everything at once. "I didn't know. I was wrong. I'm sorry. They look like me. I want to be part of their lives. I want to know their names, their dreams, their fears." But none of those words came out right. Instead, he said something safe, something weak. "I just wanted to see you. Them." Claire didn't flinch. "You saw them. Now go." He didn't. He came back the next day, and the day after that. Not always to speak, but just to be near. Eventually, she stopped sending him away with words and started using silence instead. It was an improvement. He began leaving things behind, anonymously, at first. A donation to the foundation that had helped her. An envelope dropped off at the school, covering a year's worth of supplies. Repairs made to the library's heating system. He never signed his name. But she knew. She always knew. She confronted him once, asking if he was trying to buy his way into their lives. He told her no. He told her he didn't expect anything. He just wanted to help. He didn't ask to see the boys. He didn't push. Instead, he tried to be present. At the sidelines. Quiet. Careful. And eventually, they noticed him. Josh was the first to ask. "Why does that man look like us?" Claire had no answer ready. Not then. But the question stuck. The boys were too young to understand the full history, but they were smart. They saw things. They began waving at him when he passed by. Jake once ran ahead of Claire to say hello. Jaden asked him if he liked dinosaurs and listed his top 5 favorites without waiting for a response. Henry knelt down, answered every question, listened to every story. He didn't try to rush anything. He didn't talk about fatherhood. He just showed up. Claire watched it all carefully, warily. She kept her distance emotionally, but she couldn't deny what she saw. Henry wasn't the man who had laughed in her face 5 years ago. That man wouldn't have waited outside a school for hours just to catch a glimpse. That man wouldn't have fixed a leaking pipe in the library anonymously. That man wouldn't have bought a modest house 5 blocks from hers and started spending more time in a town with no boardrooms or press. This man was trying, with every quiet action, to make up for 1,000 loud mistakes. Eventually, she agreed to let him join them at the park. Then a dinner. Then a school play. Slowly, painfully, he began to form a presence in their lives. Not as a father yet, but as something close. He didn't take it for granted. He didn't take it lightly. For the first time in his life, Henry Black was building something that couldn't be calculated or negotiated. And with each passing day, he realized he wanted it more than anything he'd ever owned. Claire knew it was time to tell them. She had delayed it for weeks, even months, always convincing herself that they were too young or that it wasn't the right moment. But the truth sat heavy on her chest, and it grew heavier each time her sons asked who the man was, the one who sometimes waited near the school gates, who showed up at weekend events and stayed quietly in the background, never too close, never too far. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. Jake had started to draw him in his sketchpad, always with the same ice blue eyes and stiff posture. Jaden had started waving at him as if it were a game. But Josh had questions. He always had questions. He was the one who asked, late one night while brushing his teeth, "Is he our uncle or something?" Claire had paused, toothbrush in hand, heart racing. He was so casual, so innocent. She could have laughed it off. She could have made up a lie. But the time for lies had passed. That night, after tucking them into bed, she sat on the edge of their blanket-covered feet and told them the truth. She began slowly, carefully, choosing her words like she was walking a tightrope. She told them about New York, about the life she'd lived before they were born. She told them about their father, not as a villain, not as a myth, but as a man who had once made a terrible mistake. She didn't cry, though her throat tightened. She didn't speak with bitterness, though the past still stung. The boys listened, each in their own way. Jake played with a loose thread on the blanket but didn't interrupt. Jaden stared at the ceiling, blinking slowly. And Josh, her oldest by 3 minutes, her little old soul, sat very still and watched her face the entire time. When she said his name, there was a long silence. Josh finally whispered, "But he's been here. Why didn't he say anything?" Claire folded her hands together and tried to keep her voice steady. "Because he didn't want to take anything away from you. Or from me. He thought maybe he didn't deserve to be part of your lives anymore." Jaden tilted his head, confused. "Is that why he always looks sad when he sees us?" Claire smiled, though her eyes shimmered. "Maybe. Or maybe he's just scared." Jake leaned forward, whispering like he was sharing a secret. "Can we talk to him next time?" Claire paused. Then she nodded. "Only if you want to." The next time they saw Henry, the shift was subtle but seismic. The boys approached him. They asked questions. They talked about school and favorite movies. Jake showed him a drawing. Jaden invited him to a science fair. And Josh watched. He didn't speak much, not at first. But he didn't pull away either. And that meant everything. Henry didn't try to rush into the role. He didn't declare himself their father. He didn't demand anything. He let them come to him in their own time. He listened more than he spoke. He sat on hard gymnasium bleachers during school events, clapped louder than anyone else at spelling bees, and brought snacks to soccer games. He asked them about their days, remembered their teachers' names, helped with homework when Claire was too tired to sit upright. Slowly, a rhythm formed. Not the kind of rhythm that families are born with, the kind that's built with time, patience, and the quiet decision to keep showing up. Claire watched the change in him not with naive hope, but with cautious observation. This wasn't a man performing for attention. This was someone shedding layers he hadn't even known he wore. The suits became less tailored, the phone less attached to his palm. His conversations shifted from quarterly forecasts to stories about dinosaurs and comic books. He started spending more time in their town than in the city. Eventually, he stopped returning to New York for days at a time. His team learned to adapt. They called it remote leadership. But Claire knew the truth. He had simply stopped needing the noise. People in his social circle didn't understand. Some thought he was going through a crisis. Others whispered behind his back at fundraisers and networking events, "He's changed," they said, like it was a diagnosis. Henry heard them, but he didn't care. For the first time in his life, he was building something that wasn't measured in numbers or achievements. It was messier. It required more patience than he'd ever had. And it mattered more than anything else. He bought a modest house just a few streets away from Claire's. Not a mansion. Not a statement. A home with squeaky floors and a yard big enough for 3 boys to run wild. The real estate agent had looked confused when he declined luxury listings. He just smiled and said, "It's not for me. It's for them." Claire found herself leaning on him more than she expected. At first, it was just for school pickups when her shift ran late. Then it was for doctor's appointments, birthday party planning, grocery runs. They found a balance, like puzzle pieces slowly fitting into place. They still had their differences. Arguments surfaced sometimes, about parenting, about boundaries, about the scars left behind. But they weren't destructive. They were honest. The boys began calling him Dad not because anyone told them to, but because the word started to feel right. Josh was the last to say it. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, during a walk through the park. He tripped and scraped his knee. Claire rushed over, but Henry was closer. He scooped the boy up gently, brushed the dirt from his hands, and said, "You're okay, buddy." Josh clung to him tightly, buried his face in Henry's shoulder, and whispered, "Thanks, Dad." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Henry froze, eyes wide, then held him tighter. It wasn't a grand moment. There were no witnesses, no applause. Just a scraped knee and a whispered word that carried more weight than anything Henry had ever earned before. In that small town, with its quiet streets and second-hand charm, Henry finally learned what it meant to love not with gestures, but with consistency. Not with power, but with presence. And as spring bloomed around them, the past began to loosen its grip. The pain didn't disappear, but it softened. It became part of the foundation they were building, rather than a wound left untended. And for the first time in his life, Henry Black didn't just have a reason to stay, he had a home. It started as a cold. Nothing serious, Claire had thought, just a cough that lingered longer than usual, a bit of fatigue, a headache that came and went. She brushed it off. As a mother of 3 boys, she had learned to push through discomfort. She couldn't afford to slow down. Not when there were lunches to pack, socks to find, story hours to host at the library, bills to manage, dinners to cook. Her days were built on motion, and she had grown used to ignoring the signals her own body sent her, a habit formed out of necessity. But this time, her body didn't let her ignore it for long. The cough deepened, became painful. Her energy drained faster than she could replenish it. One morning, while folding laundry, the room spun so suddenly that she had to sit down on the floor, clutching the fabric in her hands while she waited for the dizziness to pass. That evening, she skipped dinner, telling the boys she just needed to lie down. By the next morning, she couldn't get out of bed. Her fever spiked, her chest burned with every breath, and her limbs felt like they weighed more than her entire body. Josh was the one who found her. He had come to ask about his science project but stopped cold in the doorway. Claire was curled on her side, her face flushed, her breath shallow. His small voice called out to her, but she didn't respond. He ran to get his brothers, and then together, trembling and scared, they called the only person they could think of, the man who had promised them he'd always be there. Henry didn't hesitate. He answered the phone on the first ring. Claire's voice wasn't on the other end, it was Jake, frightened and unsure, asking if he could come quickly because Mom isn't waking up right. Henry's car engine was roaring within a minute. He ran more red lights that morning than he had in his entire life. By the time he arrived, the boys were sitting in the living room, holding each other tightly. Henry didn't ask questions. He rushed to Claire's room and found her barely conscious, murmuring incoherently, her skin burning with fever. Panic rose in his throat, but he shoved it down. This was not the time to fall apart. He called for an ambulance, packed a bag for her without knowing what to include, and carried her gently down the steps like she was made of glass. The boys watched him, their eyes wide, their trust clinging to him like a lifeline. The hospital room was sterile, too white, too cold. Machines beeped softly. Claire had pneumonia, serious, aggressive, and worsened by exhaustion and dehydration. The doctors told him she had likely ignored the symptoms for weeks, maybe longer. They said she needed rest, fluids, antibiotics, close monitoring. They said he should prepare for a long stay. So Henry stayed. He didn't leave her side. He set up a cot in the room and refused to be moved. He held her hand through the night, even when she was too far gone to feel it. He brushed the hair back from her face, whispered things she couldn't hear, apologized over and over, not just for the past, but for not seeing sooner how much she had been carrying on her own. In those quiet hospital nights, something changed in him. He had known before that he loved her. He had known he wanted to be a father. But this was different. This wasn't about redemption anymore. This was about devotion. Real devotion, the kind that didn't ask for anything in return. During the day, he took care of the boys. He made breakfast with burned toast and uneven pancakes. He helped with homework, tied shoes, found lost backpacks, sat with them at night until they fell asleep. He read Jaden's favorite dinosaur book until he could recite it without looking. He listened to Josh talk about the solar system, even when the boy repeated facts 3 times in a row. He let Jake cry into his chest when he missed Claire too much to pretend he was okay. He didn't have all the answers. He wasn't perfect. He was still learning. But he was present. He was trying. And the boys began to lean on him, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. When Claire finally woke, her body weak and trembling, the first thing she saw was Henry sleeping in the chair beside her bed, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, dark circles under his eyes, her hands still held in his even in sleep. She couldn't speak at first. She didn't have the strength. But she cried. Quiet, grateful tears that fell onto the pillow and disappeared into the fabric. When Henry stirred and saw her eyes open, he didn't speak either. He just exhaled, like he had been holding his breath for days. He leaned in, pressed his forehead to hers gently, and let the silence say what words couldn't. Recovery was slow. There were weeks of follow-up visits, medications, strict instructions. Claire was frustrated by her body's limitations, but Henry refused to let her lift a finger more than necessary. He drove her to appointments, stocked her kitchen, arranged work leave with her library supervisor. He even learned how to braid Jaden's hair when Claire couldn't lift her arms long enough to finish the task. They didn't have a dramatic conversation about what it all meant. There were no declarations, no speeches. Instead, there were 1,000 small moments that spoke louder. Claire waking to find a steaming mug of tea by her bedside. Henry sitting quietly beside her, answering emails one-handed so he could hold hers with the other. The boys giggling in the next room as he tried to follow a complicated pancake recipe because Mom likes the ones with blueberries. And in the spaces between it all, something new was born, not just trust, but peace. Henry was no longer trying to win them over. He wasn't trying to make amends. He was simply living with them, for them, among them. It was in the way he didn't flinch when Claire snapped out of exhaustion. The way he carried her when her legs gave out in the hallway. The way he prayed, really prayed, for her health at night, long after the boys were asleep. Claire had once thought that healing meant forgetting. Now she knew better. Healing was remembering and choosing to love anyway. It was letting the past exist without letting it define the future. And as she regained her strength, surrounded by the family she had built, messy, imperfect, beautiful, she realized something else. Henry hadn't just become a part of their lives. He had become the reason they were whole. Spring returned like a promise, soft and slow, melting the last crusts of snow from the rooftops and waking the earth with cautious warmth. The trees outside Claire's window began to bud with tiny green leaves, shy at first, then braver with each day. Crocuses peeked through the soil. The sun lingered a little longer each afternoon, and the air smelled of rain and new beginnings. For Claire, it was the first season in years that didn't feel like survival. It felt like breathing. Like arriving. Her strength had returned gradually, not all at once. There were days when she still had to sit down after a short walk, and nights when the ache in her lungs reminded her just how close she'd come to disappearing. But Henry had been there for all of it, not hovering, not smothering, just steady. He had built himself into the fabric of their life so thoroughly that Claire no longer remembered what it had been like to go through a day without seeing him in it. She didn't question it anymore when she heard his footsteps in the kitchen or saw him folding laundry or found her favorite tea already steeped and waiting for her on the porch. It was like he had always been meant to be there, but life had taken a long and painful detour to bring him home. The boys had blossomed too. With Henry present, something in them had shifted, not a change in behavior, but a deepening of spirit. They laughed louder. They bickered with more confidence, knowing someone besides their mother would intervene with calm authority. They came home from school eager to tell two adults their stories. They curled up with Claire for bedtime and then dragged Henry into the room too, demanding that he do the voices in the story because his were funnier. The house no longer felt like a place of constant effort. It felt like family. Not patched together. Not borrowed. Real. One evening in late March, nearly a year after the gala where Henry had first seen Claire again, he asked if she would be willing to come with him to a dinner. Nothing formal, he promised. No donors, no reporters. Just dinner. She hesitated, but agreed. There was something in his voice, not anxious, but intentional. She couldn't say no. She asked the boys if they wanted to come along, and they lit up, already pulling on button-up shirts and fixing their hair with more care than usual. When they pulled up to the restaurant, Claire recognized it immediately. It was the same place where the charity gala had been held the year before, the night everything had changed. The memory hit her with a strange weight. That evening had shattered her. This one, she suspected, might put her back together. Inside, the room had been rearranged. There were no round tables, no auction paddles, no clinking champagne glasses. Just a long wooden table set for 5, covered in soft candlelight and wildflowers in glass jars. Someone had set a playlist of quiet jazz and instrumental piano. The staff knew them by name. Everything had been prepared in advance. Dinner passed with laughter and little spills, with Jaden knocking over his juice and Jake sneaking extra bread rolls and Josh correcting the waiter on the scientific name of the herb in his soup. Claire watched it all with a smile tugging at her lips, her hand resting gently near Henry's. They didn't need to touch. They were connected in a way that went deeper than fingers could reach. After dessert, the boys were invited to the back kitchen to tour the bakery, something prearranged with a knowing wink from Henry. The moment the three of them vanished around the corner, Henry stood slowly and reached into his jacket pocket. Claire's breath caught before he even moved. He didn't go down on one knee like men did in movies. He didn't pull out a velvet box with a diamond that blinded the eye. Instead, he knelt in front of her, holding a simple silver band between his fingers, and looked up at her with a vulnerability she had never seen in the man who once ruled boardrooms and struck fear with a glance. He didn't ask for forgiveness. That had already been given in 1,000 quiet ways. He didn't beg for love. He knew he had it, though neither of them had spoken the words aloud. Instead, he asked for a chance. A chance not to rewrite the past, but to build the future, together, with the 3 boys who already called him Dad without hesitation. His voice didn't shake, but there was something raw in it. I'm not asking you to forget anything. I'm asking you to choose me, now, knowing everything you know. I want to be your partner. Not your rescue. Not your apology. Just, yours. Claire looked at him, truly looked at him. Not as the man who once broke her heart. Not as the stranger who had stood at the edge of a schoolyard months ago. But as the man who had held her hand through illness. Who had memorized their bedtime routine. Who had showed up when it mattered most. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She simply nodded, then whispered one word, yes. There was no applause. No dramatic kiss. Just a quiet exhale from both of them, like something heavy had finally been set down after being carried for too long. The boys came rushing back into the room moments later, already mid-argument over who had seen the bigger cookie in the kitchen. Josh noticed the ring first. He grinned. Wait, are you guys getting married? Claire laughed, reaching for Henry's hand. No, she said, looking around at all 4 of them. We're becoming a family. Officially. That night, as they drove home under the pale glow of streetlights, Claire stared out the window and thought about how far they'd all come. The broken pieces of her past were still part of her, but they didn't cut anymore. They formed a mosaic, imperfect and beautiful, held together by forgiveness, effort, and love that chose to stay. They hadn't started over. There had been no clean slate. But they had started again, from where it truly mattered. Not at the beginning. But at the turning point. Where love doesn't shout, it shows up. Where pain doesn't end the story, it rewrites the next chapter. Where family isn't something you inherit, it's something you build, one brave day at a time.